discussion. And last time, we have discussed Hobbes and Locke, especially with their importance in how they influence the concept of rights, different from the concepts of rights that we have discussed in the 16th century. And I'm sure you remember that the rights that we have discussed in edifices of some of the religions or some of the traditional communities, or even in the Roman law, or even in the Greek philosophy, the idea was just how to regulate the individual versus individual relationship and a way of creating a harmonious society, or by negatively defining rights, or by setting up a peaceful and harmonious coexistence between individuals, then the rights of individuals will be respected. Not a positive prescription of rights to individuals as a means of claims against the state, but as a means of like a give and take relationship between individuals. Like I'm religious edifice pick and concept when those shall not kill and below. I'm translated the right to life and positive prescription of rights. And mostly at an international level after 1945, but as we are going to see, even as early as the 18th century, especially in these two declarations, that rights were begun to be defined in a positive manner, not only positively defined, but as a claim against the state. Then the relationship changes from an individual versus an individual to an individual versus the state relationship. Though with a different philosophical aspect, Hobbes and Locke propounded the idea that individuals are right bearers, while the state is under obligation to respect at least some of the rights of individuals that were set upon to the state while forming the social contract. Hobbes, we have seen, considers as absolute surrender of rights of individuals to the state. Then in return, the state is obligated to maintain peace and order, or to provide what we call the protection of the individual from, scourge of war, for example. We have seen during the times of Hobbes and in the times of Locke, a number of wars between communities and even wars between religions. And the main suffering of individuals by the 16th and 17th century was mainly from war. Then their tactical approach was how to avoid war so that to reduce the suffering of individuals, which means to protect individuals from the consequences of war. Then Hobbes came up with the idea of what we call an absolute surrender of rights in return for an absolute protection from the state. But we have seen again, there was an implied right propounded by Hobbes. And that right is the right to resistance or the right to rebellion, but only under one condition. And that condition is what? Individuals have the right to resistance only under one condition, and that condition, according to Hobbes, is what? When can individuals resist? The authority of the Leviathan or the absolute power of the state? Yeah, when the state fails to provide protection. But what sort of protection? Again, there was a qualification for Hobbes. Because the obligation of the state emanates from what? The obligation of the state, or the obligation of the Hobbesian state, emanates from what? From the social contract, or the social compact. And the protection, which is envisaged in the social contract, is the only source of right to resistance for an individual in a Hobbesian state. But in all other circumstances, individuals cannot resist the absolute authority of the state. The reason why Hobbes came up with an absolutist state was obvious. We have said that Hobbes have looked at almost 3 revolutions and have seen a number of wars. He has lived himself throughout these wars. And the main problem that Hobbes saw for having all these types of wars or disturbances was the absence of a single authority that can dominate the individual authority or the individual power of the communities. So that's why he wanted to create, some kind of, ghost as some academicians describe it, that exceeds even the combined power of the individuals within the community. በዛን ሰዓት የነበረው ጦርነት ምክንያት ብሎ የሚያስበው ሆቤስ እያንዳንዱ ሰው absolute power, not absolute, at least እያንዳንዱ ሰው power አለው, but there was no power that exceeds the power of the existing individuals within the community. Then የነዚህን power accumulate አድርጎ without any type of interference. And again, in the slide ላይ ማስቀምጫለሁ አንድ ፖይንት አለ. The absolute power of the Leviathan is not subject to any type of individual challenge. Individual challenge ሊያደርጉት አይችልም. Because the Leviathan is subjected to what only? The Leviathan is under obligation to respect what? To respect what? Not the social contract. That's, as a way to bring the right to resistance. Social contract respect ማድረግ ያለበት resistance avoid ለማድረግ ነው. But if the Leviathan is working according to the social contract, obviously there will be no resistance. And if there is no resistance, the Leviathan is, to subject itself only to the demands of what? According to the slides that I distributed. It's subjected only to natural law, not even to man-made law. The absolute Leviathan can make a number of laws, but these laws bind only what? እነዚህ ለቤተሰብ የሚያወጣቸው ህጎች ባይንድ የሚያደርጉት ማለት ነው? Only the individuals within the community. But the Leviathan is not bound by those laws made even by himself. ማስታወቂያቸው ህጎች ራሱ Leviathan አይገዙትም or limit አያደርጉትም. It's only to the natural law. And we will see the problem with natural law when we see some of the criticisms to the American and French declarations, especially by Jeremy Bentham, where he saw that natural law is metaphysically uncertain, and even to some extent it's a fiction. We don't know what natural law is. And this is, even the basis of the criticism that we find in natural law, which was dominating especially in the second half of the 18th century and even almost 19th century, and even until the first period of the 20th century, what we call emerged the positive law tradition. And that's where laws made by man bind not only the individuals but also the power in authority or the authority in power. But according to Hobbes, and even to some extent according to Locke, which later was modified by the American Declaration of Independence, was that the king or the authority is only limited by natural law and sometimes what we call general principles and natural law. But for Locke, though with the same premise, and we have seen an added premise to what Hobbes calls state of nature, and for Locke wanted to come up with a different sort of power arrangement, he came up with a second premise, and that second premise was men were created what? Men were created equal. If men were created equal, then obviously they cannot create, a power which is beyond theirs. That's what we call the concept of limited surrender of rights to the authority. Not an absolute surrender, but a limited surrender to the authority or to the state. And the state in return is obligated under the social contract, even according to law, to respect these at least minimum retained rights of the individual. The rights to what? The rights to life, property, and liberty. And we have seen again in our previous class, liberty is not just one right, it's a bundle of rights. It refers to the type of freedoms that an individual can exercise for himself without affecting the rights of other fellow individuals. ከሌላ የሌሎችን ሰዎች ኢንተርፊር ሳያደርግ ሊሰራቸው የሚችሉ በሙሉ ፍሪደምስ የምንላቸው ሊበርቲ ብሎ ያስቀምጣል። አሁን ለምሳሌ ራይት ቱ ፕራይቬሲ ጠቅሰን ነበር። ዊዝን ማይ ሆም እኔ በቤቴ ውስጥ የማደርገውን ነገር የሌላውን ሰው መብት አፌክት ሊያደርግ እስካልቻለ ድረስ it's my freedom to do whatever I wish to do within the sphere of my home. And freedom of expression, again, this freedom of expression is limited by the rights of others and later developed, again, international instruments by other circumstances like, the security of the state itself and the rights of others. And there are two more additional limitations to the freedom of expression. Then liberties, in the concept of liberty, according to law, all these types of freedoms that can safely be exercised by an individual without affecting the rights of other individuals. So liberty or the concept of liberty to look is much more than just a single right. It's a collection of rights categorically considered as freedoms. We will see them more elaborated in the American Declaration as well as in the French declarations. But most importantly, elaborated especially in the 1948 UDHR and even in the subsequent international documents. Most of them, drew their inspiration from the concept of liberty in Lockean state. Then this is the difference between Hobbes and Locke. But the important thing that you have to bear in mind is that the rights prescribed by both Hobbes and Locke, though with a different consequence, were as a means to state to limit state power, or what we call to regulate, limit, according to Locke at least. But even to Hobbes, it's to regulate the relationship between the individual and the state. የሁለቱም idea ምንድነው? Individual and the state, so long as they can live together, then they must be regulated. One means of regulation is the idea of rights. And even to Locke, it was further one step that rights are limitations to state power. That the concept of rights mostly is the Lockean concept of rights. Not only as a means of regulating the behavior between the individual and the state, but as a means to limit state power. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with the two most important books of John Locke, the two treatises of civil government. እንደዚህ ሁለት ኢምፖርታንት መጽሐፎች ናቸው። የሎክ አይዲያን ሞስትሊ ፕሮፓውንድ የሚያደርጉ he has a number of writings, but of all the writings, it's the two treatises of government that define what government is and how government is to be structured. And then this is almost even a direct copy that you find especially in the American Declaration of Independence of 1776, and more elaborately Act 1791, what we call the Bill of Rights, which were added to the Constitution of the US of 1789 as a means of amendment. The Yolo concept is in even to the French Declaration of 1789, the French Declaration on the rights of man and of the citizen. We will see the implication of such description when we proceed, but at least even the French Declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen draw their inspiration mainly from John Locke, but with an subsequent John Locke with a similar type of philosophy but with some extended philosophy of rights came up with, I'm not sure if you are familiar with Montesquieu. Anyone familiar with Montesquieu? Montesquieu. The pronunciation may not be correct, but a French philosopher of the 18th century that influenced even the major revolution that happened in France. And it's the combined effect of Locke and Montesquieu that we find the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. And of the citizen. But both declarations are important for a number of reasons. One, they are the first documents to specifically outline, a description or a number, a list of rights. It's for the first time that we have rights listed out as 1, 2, 3, and 4, and even certain types of rights in the Bill of Rights of 1791. We will see the process how they came up to exist and became part of the Constitution. They were not initially part of the Constitution, but were later added 2 years ago as a means of amendment or in the form of an amendment of a number of reasons. But at least these are the first documents that we have in history, the first 2 documents in history. Obviously in the form of national legislation, not at international level, international level, like it happened only in 1945 with the UN Charter, but at national level, these are the 2 first documents that give us an outline or a list of different types of rights. The second major reason that is of interest to listed these 2 declarations is because they are mainly the source of the 1948 EUDHR. The EUDHR was mainly influenced by these 2 documents. And there are 30 types of rights in the EUDHR, I'm sure you are familiar. And of the 30, almost 15 or 16 of them, the first 15 or 16 articles, are almost a direct copy of the American and French declarations. And they had a major contribution. To the drafting process of the 1948 UDHR, because it's the UDHR which is the starting point to all the types of international human rights that we have today. Then, when discussing the American and French declarations, we are indirectly discussing the source of what? The source of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And with this there is an attachment, as we are going to see most probably in our next class, and as outlined in our first class. Is the major debate in international human rights law, and even considered as the most challenge that the international human rights movement have ever faced, is the debate between the source of human rights. That gave to the debate considered as relative or universal nature of human rights. Human rights universal nature, which means the value of human rights applies to everyone, everywhere. That's the concept of universalism. But the concept of relativism is there are no universal values. Values depend on the nature of the community itself. Then if values come from culture, then definitely there are no universal values. If there are no universal values, then definitely there are no universal human rights. So the human rights are prescribed by the international documents that not it's not only an academic debate, it's a practical debate. ባለፈው የሆነ ኤግዛምፕል አንስቼላችሁ ነበር ሳንጨርስ ዋን ኤግዛምፕል ማለት ነው decriminalization of some of the activities considered as private in nature. በባህሪያቸው ፕራይቬት የሆኑ ማድረስ again it's the idea of the West. They think that these activities are purely private in nature. They do not affect even the interest of other individuals. For example, homosexuality, same-sex marriage. And now wonder no matter what you ማንን አፌክት አደርጋለሁ? Who cares? ወንድ ላግባ ሴት ላግባ ሌላ ሶስተኛ ጾታም ካለ that's the idea. That's why decriminalization እየጨመረ ሲሄድ especially after the Cold War, especially after 1990 እስከ 1990 ያለው የhuman rights process 1945 after 1990 it was tainted by the Cold War. then ያኔ ሜጀር የhuman rights አጀንዳ አሁን ባለው መልኩ ይገለጻል። but after 1990 Cold War ካበቃ በኋላ the West moved into pressurizing other countries in the world. በዚህ ፊልድ ብቻ ነው የምናወራው። there were a number of economic influences, political change, but even in the concept of right there was a big wave of change after 1990, what we call the decriminalization process. and ሀገሮች እነዚህ decriminalizing ያደረጉ pressure እያየለ ሲሄድ there was a harsh response. ባለፈው አንስተን ነበር Nigeria last year, as early as last year, they came up with a harsh law. Homosexual መሆን ብቻ ሳይሆን ከሆሞሴክሹዋል ጋር መሄድ ራሱ ምንድን ነው? It's a criminal act. Uganda, they came up with a harsh law with a punishment of up to 20 years. Imagine 20 years in ሀገር ለምን ነው የሚፈረደው? For the most serious crimes, no? Then homosexuality is not a trivial crime or a petty crime, but a serious crime according to the new legislation in Uganda. This is a response to the aggressive move of the West. The aggressive move of the West to decriminalize these private acts. Then universalism, relativism, now at a metaphysical level, I can discuss it. It's at a practical level. Then እነዚህ like Uganda ነው ለምሳሌ justify የሚያደርጉት ይሄ homosexual act የሚሉት justify የሚያደርጉት ምንድን ነው? It may be acceptable in the Western community, but it's not acceptable at least in Uganda. The Ugandan community does not accept the type of act which is perverted by a homosexuality. በእኛ ሀገር ተቀባይነት የለውም ማለት ምን ማለት ነው? በዌስት or በእንግላንድ for example or the United States maybe acceptable act ሊሆን ይችላል። በእኛ ግን acceptable አይደለም ሲሉ indirectly ምን እያሉ ነው? የእኛ ካልቸር ይህን ቫልዩ ሳፖርት አያደርግም ነው። that's the message. የእናንተ ካልቸር ያንን ቫልዩ ሰፖርት ሊያደርግ ይችላል። የእኛ ካልቸር ግን ይህን ቫልዩ ሰፖርት አያደርግም። Robert Mugabe, you know Robert Mugabe? He's a very interesting person for a number of reasons. And he was quoted in an interview. Uganda, Nigeria, within the same week, there was a move even in other countries, in Africa especially, to come up with harsh laws on homosexuality. And Robert Mugabe was interviewed about this agenda, and you know what he said? If Obama wants me to allow same-sex marriage in Zimbabwe, then let me marry him first by example.
funny joke ይመስላል, but it's beyond that. What does it mean? Let me tell you first by example. Same-sex marriage in Zimbabwe because the Bush was from the Obama administration in the US. The Obama personally may not be in favor of what? Homosexuality or same-sex marriage. But the politics in the United States and in some states, even in the United States there is strong opposition. There are what we call traditional communists within the US. There are what we call conservative communists within the US. And of the 53 US states, only 12 allow same-sex marriage. In the rest, discrimination of my recognition. But in the 2 years before, I don't know if you follow the news, 2 years before there was a referendum in California to allow same-sex marriage. It's a private act. Same-sex legal, but it's not recognized by the state law. It's not recognized by the benefits of a family That's the definition. And since I think it's 1960 or 65, Supreme Court of the United States privatized privacy. The government cannot win the realm of an individual home. It is in court settling decision. It's not in the Bill of Rights, it's not in the Constitution, but it's a right derived from what we call the right to privacy. The right to privacy. መብት ነው ግን ምንድነው በስቴት ሪኮግናይዝ ተደረገ ሳይደረግ በስቴት ሪኮግናይዝ ተደረገ ማለት there are approved relatives in the family and the family ይቆጠራል ማለት then in California 2 years ago it was a narrow 51-49 to allow same-sex marriage. Imagine 49% of even Californians do not believe that same-sex marriage should be recognized. So in debate it's not Africa versus the US. Even within the US itself, it's a big debate. So in this debate, especially the American Declaration of Independence. Because 1948, UDHR drafts it drew its mainly or most of its inspirations from this declaration. Because the declaration is sometimes your relativism debate rights are Western creations. The rights as are described by the international documents are Western creations. So they cannot be universal. And the other side of the debate next class, the importance of having a discussion on American and French declaration is to do with even the current debates that we have. So looking into the contents and then how they came up into existence will assist us in our own discussions throughout even in the codification process of human rights after 1945. And the Declaration of Independence of 1776. Again, you are all familiar with that. A number of states in what we call America, and mostly 13 states initially, were under the colony of who? Great Britain. Great Britain. Now, Locke is from where? Locke is from? Great Britain. Look at the connection and take the connection. Locke propounded in his philosophical discourse, men are what? All men are created equal. Then if all men are created equal, then how can some communities become more equal than others? Which means, what rights do Great Britain have
to govern some states and communities far away, even beyond the Atlantic Ocean. That's the initial concept that Thomas Jefferson especially came up in 1776. Then if we are all equal, then we have to be equal. And that served as a groundbreaking into the 13 colonies, the 13 independent colonies of the Great Britain to declare their independence. And they drew up what we call a Declaration of Independence. And that Declaration of Independence begins with an interesting idea as propounded by John Locke. We hold the truth to be self-evident that men were created equal. This is the initial sentence that you find in the Declaration of Independence. Then the concept of equality they had to justify. They had to justify why they are seceding from Great Britain. That's simply it's a secession movement. It's a secession movement. Then they had to justify under what ground that they are seceding. Interestingly, we will see in 1863 how they fought against secession. There were two major wars in the United States, 1776 and 1683. Both of them for the same reason, but with an opposite move. And that's for and against secession. In 1776 it was for secession. They want to secede from England, but they have to come up with a justification. At least the Queen or King of Great Britain, why they are doing that. Obviously, it can be ground. But they wanted more solid ground that cannot be challenged by the King in England or the Queen in England. And that solid ground was to be found in a philosophical discourse of equality. Then the message is, if you are saying that we are all equal, then what right do you have to make law for us? ለኛ ህግ ለማውጣት ከኛ የተለየ መብት ምን ይኖራቸዋል? Then we have to make laws for ourselves. If you say that we are all created equal, then what rights do the King of England have to levy taxes on us? ከኛ ግብር ለመሰብሰብ ምን መብት ይኖረው? And this was Locke's idea, that all individuals are created equal. That some individuals cannot be more equal than others. Then this gave them a solid ground to declare their independence from Great Britain on July 4, 1776, which is a national holiday up to now in the United States. July 4 is a national holiday. And this was the day when the Declaration of Independence was drafted. And most of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence have either studied or lived in England and France. Especially Thomas Jefferson was a student of Montesquieu, the philosopher that we have mentioned. He was a student of Montesquieu. And we have said Montesquieu propounded especially and even extensively the ideas of equality between individuals as was initiated by Locke. Montesquieu በጣም elaborated የሆነ concept of equality writer. Then Thomas Jefferson was a student of Montesquieu, and he was baptized by the concept of equality. Then when he came back to the United States and he propagated the idea that if we are equal, then we have to be equal. Equal in practice, equal in nature. Then we have to declare independence. That's why Declaration of Independence mainly drafted by Thomas Jefferson. And even the others that were in the process of drafting the Declaration of Independence were either lived in England and France or even some of them taught by the great philosophers of the contemporary period, then they had a solid philosophical background that will justify their secession movement. And they had no idea what to do next. They said, well, they are within their rights. They are within their rights to declare independence. Because men are created equal and free. Then, if men are created equal and free, then they should not be subordinate to others. They should be masters of their own destiny. That's the message. But they should be masters of their own destiny. They should be able to govern themselves. They should be able to collect taxes. They should be able to negotiate trade relations. They should be able to own property. Equal and free and calm, so they are within their natural right, you could call it, within their natural right to declare independence from the Great Britain. And in the declaration, specifically three rights propagated by John Locke, but changed in the third, were included in the Declaration of Independence. Pursuit of happiness. What does mean pursuit of happiness? The Declaration of Independence provides for almost the three basic rights that Locke considered are not surrendered to any type of authority. They are not to be surrendered even to the authority of the Great Britain. That's the idea of Thomas Jefferson. If individuals keep their rights, if these minimum individuals are kept within the individual, then this should not be even surrendered to the Queen or King of England. They are to be retained by ourselves. Then we have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, woman. Pursuit of happiness. And this, anyways, you don't find it in the Bill of Rights. We will see why there is no pursuit of happiness right in the 1791 Bill of Rights, which is a binding instrument up to date on the concept of rights in the United States. You don't find the pursuit of happiness in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights instead provides 30 type of rights, specifically detailed, that happen to the individual. But pursuit of happiness, the idea was to use property instead of pursuit of happiness. But there was a lot of difference. And this pursuit of happiness concept was especially important in the 1930s, during the Great Depression of the United States. Pursuit of happiness mainly refers to what we call the material beings that are necessary for an individual to enjoy the rest of all rights. For example, property, ownership of property, is one right of pursuit of happiness. But again, some consider the pursuit of happiness concept was designed initially to include what we call the, I don't know if it's an appropriate terminology, but the contemporary socio-economic rights. አሁን ያሉትን ቴምፖራሪ ሶሻል ኢኮኖሚክ ራይትስ into ግምት ውስጥ ያስገባ ነው የሚል ዲቤት አለ pursuit of happiness. Because social economic rights የሚያወሩት ስለምንድን ነው? ስለ material fulfillment of an individual. Beyond life and liberty, the material fulfillment of an individual is into consideration, but this, as you don't find in the 1791 bill, it's a deliberate omission of the pursuit of happiness. But initially, የሎክን idea was the property ማድረግ ይቻል ነበር. But it was the idea was beyond property. Beyond property. Property is not a civil and political right. Property is what? It's a socio-economic right. That's the exception that we find in the Western tradition on the discussion of socio-economic rights. Then, but they came up with the idea of that every individual had the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And these three rights, at least, are not subject to the King or King of England as were declared in the Declaration of Independence by the 13 independent states in 1776. Declaration declares it's not against an individual and the state in the United States. It's a right by the individual against the Queen or King in England. The Declaration of Independence 13 independent states ናቸው። እነዚህ 13 independent states ይሄ መብት አለ an individual ለው እያነሱ ያሉት not it's directly on the relationship between the 13 independent states and the individuals living within these states, but mainly it was a reference to the individuals in the 13 states vis-a-vis the King and King of England, that we have these rights and we are not surrendering them. Then the next step was to decide on the future of the 13 states, the 13 independent states. And this took a long period, for which I hope you are familiar with the process. It took them almost 13 years to come up with a draft constitution. A draft constitution. 11 years for a draft constitution and 13 years for the final constitution. And in that constitution, by the way, it's an interesting history on how they came up in drafting the most enduring constitution in the history of man. Constitution. 1789 እስካሁን ያለው ጊዜ ስንት ነው? ወደ 260 ዓመት አካባቢ ሆኖታል። ወደ 250 ዓመት አካባቢ ሆኖታል። And this is the most enduring constitution in world history. And because the drafting was so serious